You have been there for a lot of people, through a lot of things. You have shown up, held space, said the right thing at the right moment, carried more than your share, given more than was asked. And somewhere in all of that, in the long accumulation of showing up for everyone around you, there is a person you forgot to show up for, consistently, reliably, in exactly the way you show up for everyone else. That person is you. This is not a story about people who are obviously unkind to themselves. It is not about dramatic self-destruction or obvious self-neglect. It is about something much quieter and much more common. It is about the person who has learned so thoroughly and so early that it has become invisible to place everyone else's experience before their own, to override their own needs so automatically that they no longer experience the override as a choice, to betray themselves so gently and so consistently that the betrayal has long since stopped feeling like a betrayal. It just feels like who they are. Self-abandonment is what happens when a person learns that their needs, their feelings, their truth, their discomfort are less important than the needs, feelings, truth, and comfort of the people around them. And they learn it so young and so completely that by the time they are old enough to examine it, it has become the architecture of their entire identity. The thing that looks from the outside like selflessness. The thing that looks from the inside like just being a good person. The thing that is, underneath both of those, the quiet, ongoing betrayal of the self. Self-abandonment is not the same as being selfless. Selflessness is a choice made from fullness. You have enough and you choose to give some of it. Self-abandonment is a compulsion made from fear. You give because not giving feels dangerous. The person who is genuinely selfless gives and remains whole. The person who has self-abandoned gives and becomes a little less whole each time, until one day they look inward and find very little there, not because they ran out of love, because they never kept any for themselves. It shows up in very specific ways that are easy to miss because they do not look like problems from the outside. It shows up as agreeing to things you do not want to do because disappointing someone feels worse than disappointing yourself. It shows up as staying in situations, relationships, friendships that are not good for you because leaving requires prioritizing your own well-being over someone else's comfort, and that feels wrong in a way you cannot quite articulate. It shows up as expressing opinions that are calibrated to what the room can accept rather than what you actually think. It shows up as apologizing for your own emotional responses before the other person has had a chance to react to them. It shows up as making yourself smaller in every room you enter, quietly and automatically, because taking up your full space has always felt like an imposition. It shows up most clearly in the moments when your own needs and someone else's needs are in direct conflict. The self-abandoning person almost never chooses themselves in those moments. Not because they are a bad person, because choosing themselves feels so fundamentally wrong, so dangerous, so selfish, so contrary to everything they have ever understood about how to be acceptable, that the override is not even experienced as a decision. It is just what happens. Their need moves to the back, someone else's need moves to the front. And the person stands there in the aftermath, wondering why they are so tired, why they feel so empty, why showing up for everyone else has left so little of them for themselves. Self-abandonment is not what you do to others. It is what you do to yourself in the process of doing everything for others. It is the ongoing, invisible, habitual act of treating your own experience as the least important thing in every room you walk into. It starts, as almost everything in this series has started, somewhere early. Somewhere before you had the vocabulary to name what was happening or the capacity to resist it. It starts in the specific environment of learning what made you safe and what made you unsafe. What made the adults around you warm and what made them withdraw. What version of you was accepted and what version of you required editing. For some people, it started with a parent whose emotional state was fragile in a way that made managing it the child's responsibility. If you were happy, the parent was happy. If you were upset, the parent became more upset than you, or dismissed your upset, or made their response to your upset the thing that needed addressing. And the child, who was always doing the calculation of how to remain close to the person they depend on, learned very quickly to manage their own experience before it affected the parent. To not be upset, to not need things, to present only the version of themselves that kept the parent stable, to abandon the version of themselves that complicated the situation. For others, it started more subtly, with a family system that simply did not have room for the full range of human experience, where certain emotions were acceptable and others were not, where your needs were not actively rejected but were consistently deprioritized without anyone meaning harm, where the implicit message was, "We love you and your big feelings are a bit much, and it would be easier if you managed them somewhere we don't have to see them." And you did. You became the person who manages their feelings somewhere other people don't have to see them, and that person grew up and carried that management into every relationship they ever had. For others, still, it came from direct experience of what happened when they prioritized themselves, when they said no, when they expressed a need, when they took up their full space, and the response was rejection, conflict, withdrawal, or punishment subtle enough to be deniable. And the lesson was learned. Your full self is a risk. The edited version is safer. And safety is something you chose over wholeness so many times that you eventually stopped experiencing it as a choice. The self-abandonment is not weakness, it is intelligence. It was the right solution to the environment it was built in. The tragedy is that it followed you out of that environment and into every relationship you have ever had since, solving a problem that no longer exists by betraying someone who has never stopped deserving better. It feels like a low-level, persistent exhaustion that has no obvious source. You're not doing anything that looks particularly draining. Your life from the outside is fine, but from the inside, there is a tiredness that lives deeper than the surface events of your day. A tiredness that comes from the ongoing labor of being slightly less yourself in every situation, of editing and managing and adjusting, of keeping yourself in the background of your own life. It feels like not knowing what you want, not in every area. You know what you want professionally, perhaps, or what you want from a holiday, but in the areas that involve other people, in relationships, in friendships, in the daily moments where your preferences are in contact with someone else's, you often genuinely do not know what you want because you learned so early to ask what the other person wanted and then calibrate from there that your own starting position has become hard to locate. You begin from their needs and work backward, and your own needs are somewhere at the back of that calculation, small and underweighted and consistently outbid. It feels like a resentment you cannot justify, because the person building resentment is also the person who agreed to the thing they resent, who said yes when they meant no, who stayed when they needed to leave, who gave when they needed to keep. And the resentment has no clean target because it is not directed at the person who asked. It is directed at the self who agreed, who overrode, who abandoned. And you cannot quite be angry at yourself in a way that resolves anything, so the resentment just lives there, quiet and chronic, like everything else. And it feels, and this is the part that is hardest to admit, like love. It feels like caring deeply about people and showing that care through sacrifice and accommodation and putting yourself last. It feels like being a good person. It feels like the most natural and noble expression of who you are. And that feeling is the thing that makes it so hard to see. Because how do you question something that feels like your greatest virtue? How do you examine something that looks from every available angle like strength? You question it by looking at the cost, by honestly accounting for what you have given away over the years in the name of caring for others, by asking what you have left, by sitting with the honest answer to the question, who am I when nobody needs anything from me?
and finding out whether there is enough left to answer.
Think about the last time you said yes to something you did not want to do. Not a small social commitment, something that cost you. Something that required you to override what you actually needed in order to provide what someone else needed. And think about how long it took before you noticed you had done it, whether you noticed at the time, or whether you only noticed later in the tiredness that followed, in the quiet afterwards when the accommodation was done and you were left with the feeling of having been slightly less present in your own life for a while. Think about the last time someone asked what you wanted and you genuinely could not answer, not because the question was complex, because the question was about you, and questions about you have always taken longer, have always required more searching, have always arrived with slightly less confidence than your answers about what the people you love might want or need. And think about this. If you woke up tomorrow and decided to take your own needs as seriously as you take the needs of the people you love, what would be different? Not in a dramatic way, just in the ordinary moments of the day. The decisions you would make differently, the conversations you would have that you currently avoid, the things you would stop doing, the things you would start, the spaces you would take up that you currently compress yourself to avoid occupying. Because here is the thing that self-abandonment costs you beyond the obvious. It costs the people around you access to the real version of you. When you are always accommodating, always adjusting, always calibrating to what the room can receive, the people in your life are relating to a managed version. They think they know you, but they know the edited one, and they are building their love for you on a foundation that is missing its most important parts. You are not letting them love the real you. You are making sure they only ever love the version that requires nothing of them. And that is a lonely way to be loved. Coming back to yourself after a long period of self-abandonment is not a dramatic event. It is not a single decision or a turning point or a conversation that changes everything. It is a very quiet, very ordinary, very daily practice of choosing yourself in the small moments, of noticing the override as it happens and pausing before it completes, of asking what you actually want and staying with the question long enough for an honest answer to arrive, of saying no to one thing that you would previously have said yes to, of expressing one preference that you would previously have suppressed, of taking up a little more space in one conversation. It is not selfish. That is the fear, and the fear is wrong. Choosing yourself is not taking something away from the people you love. It is giving them access to something they have never had, the real version of you. The one that disagrees sometimes, the one that needs things, the one that is not always available and not always accommodating, and not always the person who makes everything easier for everyone else. That version is more interesting than the edited one. That version is capable of actual intimacy rather than managed closeness. That version is somebody the people who love you can actually know. The person you abandoned is still there. That is the important thing. Not lost, not destroyed by the years of being placed last, just very quiet, very far back, very accustomed to being overridden, but still there, still having preferences, still knowing when something is wrong, even when you have trained yourself not to say so, still feeling the tiredness, still keeping track of the cost, even when you tell yourself you are not keeping track. That person deserves the same quality of presence you have been giving everyone else. They deserve to be listened to with the same attention you give to the people you love. They deserve to have their needs taken seriously in the same way you take seriously the needs of the people around you. They deserve to be chosen, not instead of the people you love, alongside them, as one of the people you love, as perhaps the most important one, the one whose well-being makes all the other caring possible, the one you have been leaving behind this whole time, the one who has been waiting, patiently and without complaint, for you to finally come back. Next episode, there is a person who grieves relationships that are still alive, not someone who has died, someone who is still here, still calling, still present in the technical sense, but the version of them that mattered, the one you needed, the one you built something with, that version is gone, and nobody gives you permission to grieve what you haven't lost. That one is next.